Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So today I'm going to tackle the question, why do quote unquote progressive people hate Christianity? Now I know that that sounds like a very amorphous question to ask, and I'm sure that people could write entire books on the subject. So I'm going to laser focus in on what I see as the primary difference between the two, and from that point expand on it to show why the quote unquote progressive mindset is counter to the very basis of Western civilization, especially the parts of culture which I usually talk about, which is a traditional hero, both in your life and on the page, and storytelling. And I'm doing so in part to answer the question that I usually get, which is, can the cultural institutions that we have be revised back to what they should be? And I would say, no, they have to fall. Or at the very least, they have to fall in the present form that they are at. You would have to completely extract, quote unquote, progressivism from those institutions in order for them to work correctly. And that's just too much of a task right now. It will be easier to tear them down and start anew. Which, by the way, isn't playing into their hands. It's actually a very American, well, North American, New World kind of thinking, wherein you look at the old institutions and say, they're outdated. Time to revamp, time to create something better, time to let merit take over, and the new institution will simply outperform the old, and the old will fade away and die. But before we get too deep into that, I just want to let everyone know that there is a link in the description and the pinned comment for my new book, which is coming out called Fade to Blue. It is the sign up page for that book so that if you leave your email address there, you will be informed via email when the project goes live. You can also watch the trailer while you're there and see some of the art. It is basically, as I usually say, Indiana Jones meets film noir. And it's set in 1929, 1930s. You're looking at some of the art from that in the background right now. So if that looks interesting to you at all, click on that link in the description and go on over and see a little bit more about the project. And if you want, leave your email address so you can be informed when the project goes live. But back to our topic. And the topic, to try to boil it down once again, is basically why your quote unquote progressive mentality is counter to the basis of Western civilization, which, like it or not, is Christianity, and especially how that plays out in culture. Now, if people are here for the first time and don't know much about my channel, I'm not a channel that discusses culture specifically. I'm a channel that discusses the traditional idea of a hero and how that plays itself out within our culture, especially within storytelling. But there is a distinct and very strong connection between storytelling and culture. Very briefly, if we go back to one of the parents of Western civilizations, which is ancient Greece, the pinnacle of thought, which is Athens, and one of the two greatest thinkers of that time, which is Plato, writing in the 400s BC, he talked about this within his seminal work called The Laws. When he gets down to it, when he wants to lay out how the rubber hits the road, he does three things. Number one, he sets down what the laws of the best society should look like. Number two, he talks about how the people within that society should act in a noble way in order to follow those laws. And number three, how that entire thing is supported by the culture. And the first thing he talks about is what kind of stories should this society gravitate towards? You might even say allow. And oh, by the way, despite I'm sure protesting in the comments, his very first thing is to go after what we would basically call quote unquote progressive rainbow flag stories of today. He talks about the story of Ganymede and how he was abused by Zeus, and how such a story should not be allowed in a civilized society because all it is there for is to excuse the wickedness of the people who want to promote such activity. But let's get back to the initial question and answer that before I get too far. What is the clearest distinction, according to the topic that I'm focusing in on, between progressivism and Christianity? What is the point which they absolutely do not agree on and is fundamental for both? Well, that's simply the idea of forgiveness. For Christianity, the idea of forgiveness is central. Within the most prominent prayer of Christianity is the line, "Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us." This is what Augustine of Hippo called the terrible promise, which is to say, I wish God to forgive me for all the wrong that I have done, especially towards him, but he should only forgive me as much as I forgive other people. Terrible promise, by the way, in that it can leave you terrified. It can leave you shaking in your boots. Why? Because even the slightest offense against God requires an infinite amount of repayment. Why? Because he's all good. He has the highest station. Just as we have in our culture right now a difference between someone who assaults a random stranger and someone who assaults the president, he's going to receive more punishment. Or let's say someone who assaults a random person on the street and someone who assaults a tiny little baby, they're going to receive more punishment because of the station of the individual, because of the innocence of the individual. God has the greatest station, the perfect, infinite station. He is without blame. Therefore, even the slightest offense against him requires an infinite repayment. And we, being finite creatures, cannot repay the infinite. Therefore, if we wish God to forgive us, then we must forgive others in a perfect way. This is also expressed in the lines of, how many times should I forgive the person who offends me? 7 times? And the answer is no, 7 times 70 times. Now, if you don't know, according to ancient understanding, the number 7 represents perfection. So the question is, do I have to forgive them a perfect number of times? And the answer is no. You must magnify perfection in your forgiveness. And this is the sticking point that absolutely runs contrary to the entire basis of progressivism. Because progressivism says we have heroic victims. Now let's concentrate on the victim part for a second. The whole point of the victim mentality is to say, rightly or wrongly, I would say wrongly, but we'll leave that aside for the minute. They say, you have wronged me or my ancestors in the past, therefore you owe me. And it's usually expressed according to some identity marker. I'm a woman. I have skin that isn't white. I have preferences that are not normal. I am not a Christian. Therefore, you have made me, or your society has made me, a victim in the past, and therefore you owe us reparations for that. And this is why they tag the line of social justice onto it. Because what is justice? Justice is to render to everyone what is their due. Therefore, if you have unjustly taken something away from someone else, you justly owe them repayment for what you have taken away. And they're expanding this to a societal sense, and they're saying, we will never forgive this. And that's the entire idea behind systemic oppression, behind reparations, behind the victimhood mentality, is that there is no forgiveness. They might hint at, oh, maybe we will forgive you, but there is never, ever any forgiveness. Because forgiveness says, yes, I know you owe me this, even according to justice, but I'm going to forgive that debt. And their supposed debt that they lay at the feet of their so-called oppressors will never be forgiven. There will never be enough that you can repay. We can see this very easily in our culture. The whole idea of slavery in America. When the slaves were freed, they were told, okay, you're free now. Here's a mule and some land to make up for what has happened to you individually. That was supposed to be the repayment. That was not enough. And so we got various other things, like affirmative action, to say, okay, we owe you some more. Here, have this. That repays our debt. And that lasted for a couple of decades until they said, nah, it's not enough. Now we have the idea of reparations. We have people like Ta-Nehisi Coates, who writes for Marvel and is a so-called novelist in his own right, going before Congress, talking to them about how descendants of slaves all deserve free money because this is a reparation, a repayment for what has unjustly been done to them. And they make no bones about it right now. Whereas in the past, they might have said, well, that's enough. Okay, you've repaid it. Now they just say, well, that's a good start. Reparations will be a good start. The point behind the entire thing is there will never be enough to repay them. And there will never, ever be forgiveness. And to bring this back to culture for a second, an example of this had just popped up within the last month. Connecting it to storytelling, there's a publisher within the UK who has decided to focus specifically on male authors. Why? Because they're looking at the entire publishing world, and they have numbers to support this, and seeing that on the whole, and usually in every specific category as well, I haven't seen any category that bucks this trend, the majority of people focused on within the publishing world are women. The majority, around 75%, of agents are women, of editors are women, of people who make the rules within the publishing houses are women, of authors that are published are women, of books that are sold are to women. And they're saying, well, there's an untapped market here. Let's actually focus on men. And what's happening? The entire publishing world is freaking out about the fact that this one small, almost indie publisher is saying, we're going to focus on men. Why? Because the entire point behind the entire thing is women are oppressed, systemically oppressed, historically oppressed. Therefore, even giving them 75% control of this entire industry is not enough. And it will never be enough. And at the heart of the entire thing is there is no forgiveness for your past sins. Even if you were to give 100%, that would still not be enough. But one other point that I wanted to bring up before I get too much into the cultural aspect of this. If we look at the distinction between the two different mindsets, the one of forgiveness and the one of never forgiving, there is a distinct difference between the two. And the one on the Christian side is distinctly Christian and runs again through our culture, through and through. It's the fact that if you look at the forgiving mindset, it's a mindset that is anchored in the now. But if you look at the quote unquote progressive mindset of never forgive, it's anchored in the past and in the future with disregard for the now. Now, not to get too theological on you, but the entire Christian mentality of living in the now, not living for the now, living in the now is tied up with the theological definition of what God is and what heaven is, because the ultimate prize is to dwell with God in heaven, and God is the eternal now. Therefore, although it is hypothesized there will be a kind of time within heaven, it is a different kind of time that we experience right now, because you're in the presence of the eternal now. Therefore, in order to prepare yourself for that time, if you want to be there, you must prepare yourself by making choices in the now, living in the now. And very briefly, this is all connected to one of the things I talk about regularly, which is the idea of will as expressed by Augustine of Hippo in the 4th century AD, and we still use today. One of his famous lines from his treatise on the will is, "The character of the human will is of moment." What does that mean? That means in the moment we decide. The difference being that in the moment in this world, we can decide one thing at the very present moment, and at the next moment decide the exact opposite. Whereas the distinction is that when you're in the presence of the eternal now, every choice is perfect and repeatable in the now. It's like building a tower where each floor is a choice, and you can build it to an infinite number of levels because each one perfectly supports the one before, because you're making choice 1 at moment 1, choice 1 and 2 at moment 2, choice 1, 2, and 3 at moment 3, choice 1 to a million at moment a million, because it's the eternal now. But anyway, getting into heady theology. The point is, a focus on the now. Fix things in the now. Deal with this now. And this is very much part and parcel of the connection of the Christian mindset with what I'm always talking about, which is the idea of logic. Because logic is conducted in the present indicative active, in the now. You want to make a good logical argument, concentrate on the now. Your language has to be in the now. And that's why so much of Christian theology begins with logical, natural law theory, and then moves on to theology. But anyway, if you look at the progressive mindset, it's anchored in the past. It's, you did this thing to us. And this, I would say, is quite specifically derived from a rejection of the logical. Goes back as far as the 1400s. They don't want to make a logical argument because they have no good logical argument. They use the past in order to support their argument by muddying the waters of what you can see. And they anchor it all in the past because you can't control the past. The past is past. You can't change the past. The past is past. Focusing on it is not going to do any good unless they can use it as a cudgel, of course, to extract something from you. And they do it according to their own ideology because they're building a better future. But this entire thing all plays into the destruction of the traditional idea of a hero, especially as it has been passed down to us for the last 2,000 years. Because the traditional idea of hero, as I always say, goes back at least 3,000 years. Aristotle defines it in the 4th century BC, working off of material that is minimum 800 years prior to him. The traditional idea is a hero that is virtuous, and of those virtues, one of them is justice, and therefore the hero pursues justice. But as I said, the idea of forgiveness is one that trumps even justice. Because it says, yes, you justly owe me this, but I will forgive you that debt, especially if I know there's no way that you can repay me. That would be oppressive. If I was to say, there's no way you can repay me, but you're going to do it for the rest of your life anyway, even if it's just. But the point of forgiveness enters into the traditional idea of a hero slowly but surely over that first 1,000 years, and distinctly over the last 2,000 years, through various means, but I would say the central one is the idea of pathos. Pathos being the Greek way of describing long suffering, which is where we get the word patience from. Patience means long suffering. And one of the key distinctions of Western civilization heroes for the last 2,000 years, as opposed to the ancient way that rejected such a mindset, and opposed to a lot of the rest of the world right now, and I'm looking specifically at Eastern cultures and their ways of portraying a hero, the difference is that pathos involves forgiveness. Not to say that it is 100% there, but I would say it's there more times than not, and it is certainly an expansion of the idea and how the heroic life should be lived. Because the forgiveness is the forgiveness of self. We can see this in various different characters. I usually go over pop culture characters like comic book characters. If we look at Batman, he's a man who typically would, for most writers, as they portray him, be a man who never forgave himself, even when he did nothing wrong. That's the dilemma of Batman. Now, there are different versions where he may have done so, but that's typically the suffering hero that we sometimes see portrayed. But if you look at someone like Spider-Man, he's a hero that started off like that started off saying to himself, I did actually do something wrong. I didn't take responsibility for the power that I had, and it caused the death of my uncle. I must therefore take responsibility for this thing. And for the first little while, he does not forgive himself. And that's where his drive comes from, until you get to about 10 to 15 years into the storyline, where he wants to stop being Spider-Man, and he finally forgives himself and moves on to be a hero who doesn't place the entire emphasis of his heroics on his guilt for not forgiving himself, but on other higher means. But even though there are various ways of expressing this within the story itself of the hero, you always get an underlying idea behind it, which is the hero acting in the now. The hero saying, I have power, and I'm going to use it to pursue justice in the now. And at this point, I'm sure, actually, before this point, I should have also mentioned that there's a difference between forgiveness and reconciliation. Forgiveness is, I forgive your debt. Reconciliation is, I forgive your debt and I will trust you again. There's the difference. I'm not talking about reconciliation. I'm talking about forgiveness. And again, this is a deep subject, the idea of the traditional hero and how it connects to forgiveness. But really what I want to concentrate on is how your quote-unquote progressive mindset does not allow your hero to act in the now, does not allow your hero the slightest bit of forgiveness, and how this supposedly redefines the idea of hero to the victim hero that your quote-unquote progressive people wish to promote. First off, this is why the new form of hero is one that is created without pathos. For Marvel Comics, their seminal character that they created, which explains why they won't let it go, is Kamala Khan. And they specifically came out and said, this is the new form of hero, and she is created without pathos. She was supposed to be the template upon which new heroes were created, being herself created by the director of content and character development. Because pathos says, I did something wrong, I'm going to forgive myself and move on in a heroic way to serve justice so that others don't have to suffer the way that I have suffered. And thus, in acting in a virtuous way, especially towards justice, they become a paragon of virtue and are thus a hero. But the progressive mentality, based on never forgiving, is quite the opposite. It is never to admit that I have done something wrong. Because if you admit that you did something wrong, that at the very least helps take out the legs of your claim that you have always been wrong. And the whole point of why these people think that you will automatically see someone like Kamala Khan or the new Falcon Captain America as heroes without them acting in the heroic way that the original form of hero needed to do in order to get there is because of their victim mentality, is because of their victim status. They're a woman. They don't have white skin. They're an immigrant. They're a non-Christian. They have odd preferences. They have been oppressed in the past. And therefore, you owe them the distinction of calling them a hero when they call themselves a hero. It's just an expansion of the idea of, I am of a minority class. I am speaking now. You must shut up. You must listen to me. And my point of view is more valid than yours because I'm part of this minority class. It's the exact same mindset. You must acknowledge them as heroes because they claim to be heroes, and you must accept that because that's the distinction that they have made. That's the repayment that they claim for the debt they claim you owe them that will never be forgiven. And this, by the way, is also why your quote-unquote progressive entertainment is so stunningly boring. You don't get to focus on the now. You don't get to focus on action. Once again, this is one of the things Marvel trotted out, saying this is the new way we make comics. It's not focused on action. Because action is focused in the now. No, they want to focus in the past, the grievances of the past, to build supposedly a better future. So you must be lectured. This is the story now. This is how the story unfolds. And this is also why your quote-unquote progressive mindset is doomed to failure. And the institutions that it now controls and will not give up are doomed to failure, are doomed to fall, and must be replaced. Because the superior way of doing anything is to, in the exact moment you're in the now, to say, okay, how's about we forget about all of that baggage from the past and just forgive, start anew, and build. This, by the way, is why I get bored with Eastern storytelling every once in a while. Sure, I read manga, I watch stuff based on manga, but I throw up my hands at some point because they think in the ancient way of no forgiveness. In the Western world, we're used to saying, so much so that it's the back of our mind, there's going to be forgiveness at some point. Even if I am serving justice, even if I am living out my sentence because I'm justly going to prison for X, Y, and Z, at some point they will let me go and there will be forgiveness. That's not the way ancient civilizations worked. That's not the way Eastern civilizations work. That's not the way so many Eastern heroes are created. If you look closely, you can see them continually punishing themselves for something that they have done in the past. Why? Because their society does that exact thing. It will never let go. There's no repayment that you can make. There's no forgiveness. You will be punished until the day you die. So you might as well punish yourself and save us the trouble. And that's the mentality that your quote-unquote progressive people want the rest of us to impose upon ourselves. You will never be forgiven. Therefore, punish yourself before we have to punish you. And it's time for the rest of us to stand up and say, that's not the way Western civilization is built. That's not the way Western civilization runs. That's not the way our culture is healthy. That's not the way people can thrive. That's not the way to be heroic. And that's not a mentality I'm going to allow you to impose upon me and mine anymore. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. And yes, I apologize. This is only scratching the surface of the entire subject. I would love to go much deeper into this entire thing. I wish I had the time to pull on every thread and write a book about the entire thing. But anyway, don't forget, there are links in the description. One of them is for the sign-up page for Fade to Blue, my new book that is coming out. If you go on over there, you can see the trailer, see some art, leave your email address so you can be informed when the project goes live. All right, I'll leave it there. I'll see y'all later.